And I hope you can all see that there. So thanks very much for the introduction, and very much thanks to the Botstiber Institute for including me in this wonderful webinar series that they have on various different species involved in fertility control programs. So the focus of my work is on rodents, and from the photo here, this is a photo taken in Tanzania. So even though it's very broadly applicable to rodents around the world, the work that I'm going to present to you is very much focused on Africa, and particularly research in Tanzania and Zambia, where my colleagues are based. So for some of you who are not really familiar with rodents, I think one of the reasons why Africa is particularly important and interesting in terms of rodents is the really severe impacts that rodents have on people's livelihoods in Africa, as well as other parts of the developing world where people really are very badly affected by rodent pest problems. And so my first few slides here are really trying to give you a bit of an overview for those of you who are not experts on rodents or know very much about rodents and the problems they cause. I just wanted to sort of highlight some of the severe impacts that they really can cause for many people around the world. So as many of you will know, you've all heard of the Black Death, but that of course is just one specific outbreak of rodent-borne diseases that's happened across the world. So bubonic plague has happened a few times around the world, as well as hantavirus outbreaks in the New World at the time of European invasions. They documented some quite severe problems with hantavirus outbreaks, which were not imported from Europe. They were naturally occurring outbreaks that happened in that part of the world. So outbreaks causing famine and civil war, that might seem quite extreme to you, but it does happen. There are these massive population outbreaks of rodents that essentially result in every food source being consumed by the rats, people starving, and in the case of parts of India and South Asia, this actually triggered a civil war some years ago. So any crops we try to grow, whatever crops they are, even things like chili, which you would think, why would rodents eat that? It can be a severe loss both in the field, and then that doesn't stop there. It goes on to contaminate the post-harvest sector, getting into factories and food processing, and really causing quite a lot of disease transmission, as well as nutritive loss, where rodents will often just take the seed germ out of seeds that are being stored in post-harvest systems. And of course, then there's all the unquantifiable damage that caused to infrastructure, roads being undermined, electrical wires being chewed through, causing fires. It's very hard to put a number on the economic cost of rodents when you think of all these impacts that are happening across health, agriculture, and infrastructure to our livelihoods. So it really is quite a serious problem at that sort of general level. So why are they still a problem? I mean, considering such problems, you'd have thought, oh, we would try to fix it by now. But one of the real challenges with rodents is that we kind of lump them all together, but there are more rodent species than all other mammals put together, and they don't have the same behaviors, the same habits, the same food preferences, the same breeding rates. And so we often don't know very much about the different species that we find in different parts of the world. And that means that, we need more capacity, that they tend to be neglected. And I would say that the problems are actually getting worse, not better. And despite everything we throw at rodents, we're also exacerbating the situation that makes them a problem. So our sanitation problems aren't necessarily improving in many parts of the world. We're growing a lot of food that rodents like to eat. So there are a lot of challenges, and at the moment, we really rely on poisons to control them. And there's a lot of issues with poisons and non-target poisoning. A lot of people are worried about the impacts of poisons in the environment and on their own health and health of animals. And many places around the world are restricting the use of poisons quite dramatically. The Netherlands is banning the use of anticoagulant poisons, and even official pest control operators, people who are trained to use anticoagulants, will have to ask for special permission to use them when they're trying to control rodents in the future. So across Europe, we suspect this will be a growing trend, that poisons and other things are going to be limited. And at the same time, we don't really have many alternatives to the control of rodents. So just to highlight some of the huge impacts that rodents can have in disease transmission, plague is still a problem in many parts of the world. And here you can see a relatively recent outbreak that occurred in Madagascar. And what was quite alarming to the authorities in Madagascar, even though they've had plague for hundreds of years in Madagascar, this was a largely human-to-human transmission outbreak where it was pneumonically transferred between people in the capital city in Antananarivo. So that really took people by surprise in a country that is often quite used to plague. Other curiosities or unexplained outbreaks is Lassa fever, which happens mainly in West Africa. Nigeria is one of the important countries involved in Lassa fever. And here again, over the last few years, there have been unexplained severe outbreaks of Lassa fever in Nigeria. We still don't understand why this is happening. It could be related to climate change, environmental change. We're still trying to understand why this is happening in Nigeria with Lassa fever. And then there are many new diseases coming about that aren't necessarily new, but not necessarily being recognized properly. So hepatitis E is something we've known has been a problem in rodents for a long time, but now it is clearly spilling over into human populations, particularly in dense urban countries such as Hong Kong and Singapore. They've noticed hepatitis E outbreaks in people. So now that people are looking, we're finding hepatitis E is a more serious problem than we believed in the past. And so although rodents were not involved in the coronavirus outbreak that we've all just so recently experienced, they were clearly involved in some of the mutations that happened to the later variants of the coronavirus. So particularly Omicron is quite clearly related to having mutated probably in Southern Africa somewhere and became a much more transmissible disease than it was originally. So the World Health Organization is really worried about a lot of these rodent-borne diseases, and they have been trying to get us all together to try to understand and have a more concerted effort to try to deal with some of these epidemic diseases. It is very much a work in progress, and we are trying to work together to develop better strategies that don't rely on poisons to deal with some of these things. Another thing that you may have recently heard about are the outbreaks in Australia, where these rat populations, in this case, it's the house mouse in Australia that gets to these huge numbers. And, you know, the economic impact is absolutely devastating. This happened after years of drought. And then when these plagues of rodents came along, farmers had to destroy all their crops that they had harvested. So you know, the impact is really quite severe in many situations. And this is a very old photo that I'm sure some of you may have seen. This is along the bottom here. You may not be able to read it, but in the box here, you can see it's a huge number of rodents caught by these chaps here back in 1917. So it's a well-recognized, quite long-standing problem in Australia, as well as parts of Africa and Asia and the Americas even in some areas. So some of the more horrifying parts of dealing with rodent pests in the developing world are things like rat bites, people getting bitten by rats, often on their feet and their hands, but it can be quite disfiguring, such as this child here has had his nose completely bitten off by a rat. And of course, a lot of infection gets into that. So this is a chap I met about this time last year in Tanzania, again, in the areas that I work. And this is you can see the quote that I have here at the top. This is a guy who was bitten by a rat some years ago, and it led to infection. Unfortunately, it wasn't treated properly, and it led to what you can see has happened to his foot there now. And that's from a rat bite, and it's just, transformed his life. He's not able to work, and, it changed the whole direction of his life. And poisons, we know they're often very difficult to use and very dangerous. And in fact, many of the poisons people do use are not legal poisons. This is something that is widely used in parts of Africa called two-step, and colloquially, because if you were to accidentally ingest this poison aldocarb, you would take 2 steps and die. It's extremely toxic. It has proper uses in agriculture, but is being illegally sold informally to kill rodents, as well as guard dogs and other things too. So there's a lot of misuse of poison out there that's really making the situation much worse. So that brings me to fertility control. I think there's a number of teams around the world that are very interested in this. We, of course, in the United States, you have Contraceptive, which is a registered compound based on fertility control with VCG and triptolide within it. There are many other groups looking at plant-derived compounds. And so, you know, there is a history of research here, but unfortunately, no real commercial products besides Contraceptive are out there. So most of the world still hasn't got access to proper products that are based on fertility control. But you know, all the science would say it should be a sensible thing to do if we can make it work for rodents, and that it should be actually more effective than the use of poisons and regulating poisons, regulating rodents, that is. So the work that I'm going to talk about is really based on the shoulders of colleagues of mine in China who started this work looking at synthetic hormones for the control of rodents. And so this is just a very short select list of some of the research that has been done on these compounds, quinastrol and levonorgestrel, which are been developed really and sort of innovated through colleagues at the Institute of Zoology, Chinese Academy of Sciences. So they continue to do research on what they are calling EP1. So that's both of these compounds together, and they've been testing it in a number of Asian rodent species and looking at some of the non-target impacts as well. So just to kind of summarize that, because there is a lot, that was just a short list there. There is, you know, from their work, we can say that most rodent species do respond to these hormones. However, it does tend to vary a little bit between different species. Sometimes it's more the males affected, sometimes the females, sometimes both sexes are equally affected. So there are these variations that we need to be aware of. On the good news side, some of the work that they've shown does show that these compounds tend to break down quite quickly, both in soil and water and in exposure to sunlight. So the tests that have been done so far, and of course it's not an exhaustive list, would suggest that these compounds are safe in the environment. There aren't a lot of other non-target effects on other non-mammal species anyway. And I will talk more about some of the issues related to this as I go on. So the first bit of work I want to highlight is work that was done in collaboration with our Chinese collaborators and colleagues at Sokoine University in Tanzania. And this is work that was done on the most common rodent pest species found across sub-Saharan Africa, which is called Mastomys natalensis, and it's often called the multi-mammet rat. So it can have very large litters of young, it reproduces very quickly and can cause these massive population outbreaks, as shown in that video from Australia. The same thing can happen with this species in Africa. So we wanted to find out, does these hormones work in Mastomys the way it has been shown in some of the Asian species? And so this was work done in the laboratory, trying to understand, what is the dose response here? So what would be the appropriate dose to use to deliver this product to Mastomys? And here you can see on this chart here, this is weighing the testis and showing a very clear decline in the size of the testis as the dosage increases in the food bait fed to the Mastomys, and an even much more marked decline in sperm count with increasing dose there is shown as well. So it was having a very clear impact on rodent male fertility. With the females, it was a little bit more difficult to elucidate, and this is partly because these are female hormones, of course. So in the female, you might expect them to not work or perhaps even enhance fertility. But what actually happens, it goes through its estrous cycle when exposed to these hormones, and then becomes in this highly edemic state, where the uterus here, you can see on the right side here, this is a Mastomys uterus that's very full of water. And that is part of the natural cycle of female fertility cycle. But it does, when exposed to these synthetic hormones, it tends to persist for a very long period of time. And how long that persists is something that I will show you some data on. But anyway, we could show that there was an impact on females. And what we really were quite pleased to show is when we had fed this bait to both males and females and then paired them, we were actually to show that it really did dramatically reduce pregnancy rate, both the percentage of pregnancy, but also the litter size went down quite dramatically. So that was a good evidence that these things were actually working on both males and females of mastomas. So further work that we did, we tried to understand, this is these are hormones that evidence suggested that, once they stop feeding on this, things are going to reverse. And so this is work where we wanted to monitor what happened to both males and females over time after they'd had that first dose of eating a bait with a fertility compound in it, and then they're taken off that fertility control bait and put onto normal bait to look at what happens to reproductive organs and pregnancy over time. So here you can see a series of graphs where we measured impact on males. So you can see the testis weight gradually increased over time. As you would expect, the testis does recover. The epididymis also recovers over time. Sperm motility and sperm count also recover, although they're not quite recovering to the same level as the untreated control group. So there is still some kind of long-lasting effect, even after the period of time, this is almost 100 days, that there is still some sort of lasting impact, but it is sort of gradually returning to normal over time. The same thing we observed with females. So in this case, remember the uterus is full of water and edema at the beginning, so that the weight of the uterus is actually quite high at the start of this observing over time what happens. And then the weight of the uterus declines over time because it's less edema occurring over time, and eventually seems to recover after about 90 days or so. So that was also quite good to see that, after a single baiting period where the rodents have eaten this bait for a week, that there is quite a long-lasting effect both on the females and the males. And so another bit of work that we wanted to do is how does this actually work in the field? So this is work that's also been published and done by a PhD student of mine, Christopher, in Zambia. And we really wanted to look at, compare the impact of fertility control and mortality control and do that in sort of maize field situation. So this was done in central sort of Zambia. You can see the area here sort of up in the middle here, and maize growing areas. And so we had a number of trapping grids in this area, which were smallholder farmer areas where people are growing maize for their livelihoods. And so the way this was designed is that we had a very large area, 200 meter by 200 meter area, where we would bait the area with either rodenticide, fertility control, or leave it untreated. So it would just be a sort of a plain bait that we would bait there. And then in the center of that, we would have a trapping grid. So these are Sherman traps. They're sort of live capture traps, which we place in this sort of grid structure here. And this is used in a capture, mark, recapture system where we capture rodents, we mark them and release them. And that allows us to understand their population abundance, their absolute abundance in the environment. So we repeat this on a monthly basis, recapturing rodents, and that allows us to calculate the abundance there. So this is done every month over a period of time after that first single baiting that happens at the beginning of the cropping season. So here you can see what the process looks like. So here's Chris making the bait. So we put dye into that to alert people that if they were to see it, they wouldn't eat it. These are what the Sherman traps look like. And then to put it out in the field, we have these little lengths of bamboo, and we put the bait inside there across this whole area and that grid that we were talking about in the field area. So you can see it's quite dry here. This is at the very beginning of the season. And just to show that, here you can see some young maize plants. This is a camera trap at night, and you can see a mastomas inside one of these bamboo stations eating the bait. So we monitored bait uptake, and we found it to, within a week's time, most of that bait would be eaten that we had put in there. So I'm not going to go into great details of the analysis. You can find it in that paper there. So we wanted to repeat this over 2 cropping seasons, and we also wanted to look at different ways of measuring abundance. So some of this was based on a common system called minimum number of alive, where you measure the number of animals. And then there's also a computer program called Density that allows you to measure rodent density. So these are figures showing the impact of the untreated control. In green, we have the EP1, the synthetic hormones, and then the blue is the rodenticide. So then on these graphs, you can see where the bait was delivered, and then you can see what happens over time in each of those cases. So what happens essentially is that the population in the untreated continues to go up, as you would expect. When you treat with a rodenticide, you do tend to get a sudden decline in the rodent population, but then of course, then the rodent population recovers over the rest of the season. Whereas with fertility control, you don't have a sudden decline, but because the animals are not able to reproduce, their populations tends to stay low, and by the end of the season, it's sort of comparable to what happened with the rodenticide. So we can't say that fertility control worked better than the rodenticide, but we can say that the effect of fertility control was quite comparable to the effect that was observed with the rodenticide. So that in itself is promising that it does seem to work, and particularly impacts on crop harvest and the amount of food that would be lost to the rodents. So as you would also expect in that analysis, you can really clearly see that the number of juveniles goes down, as you would expect when using the fertility control. You're preventing reproduction, and that's clearly not happening with the rodenticide, where the population still has quite a lot of juveniles within it. Again, if you want more details, I suggest you go to the paper where it's explained much more thoroughly than I've just been able to do in the short time we have. So the last bit of work I want to talk about is about perhaps a more important species, Rattus rattus, the black rat. This is a cosmopolitan species found in urban areas as well as in many agricultural areas as well. So this is a big pest in Africa, but of course around the world. So doing similar sort of work, we wanted to first of all understand, what is the impact of dose for each of these compounds individually as well as in combination as EP1. And we were quite pleased to see that, the food was consumed. Levonorgestrel, the impact is quite low in comparison to quinastrol, and that very much correlates with other studies done by Chinese collaborators that shows that a lot of the palatability issue comes from the quinastrol, not so much from the levonorgestrel. They're both kind of bitter compounds. So, but overall, there is a decline in food consumption, partly because of palatability, but also the effect of these hormones on appetite is known to suppress appetite to some extent. So it is a bit of a mixture of palatability and just the sort of natural phenomena of what happens when fed synthetic hormones in any animal. So again, we observed this sort of edema within the female uterus and quite a reduction in the testis as well. This graph is showing the weight gain or loss. So you'd expect in the untreated that normally you would have an increase in weight. And this is just showing that there are some slight changes and essentially that there is a weight loss going on there, but it's not very severe and it's often not very different from the untreated as well. So it was important to understand, is this going to be a bait that that rodents simply evolve to not eat because it's just not palatable and they don't want to eat it, but that does not seem to be the case anyway. So again, the proof is in the end, and when you turn in terms of rate of pregnancy and offspring, where again, these are sort of cumulative totals from all the cohorts that were involved in this study. So you can see 70% of the pairings between untreated and untreated males and females conceived, and they had quite large litters. And wherever the females had consumed the treated bait, so they'd taken the fertility, so that's these four places here. When the females have taken the hormones, there is 0 pregnancies. There is a slight increase from that where the females are controlled, so they've taken plain bait, and where the males have taken the synthetic hormones. So that does still result in some pregnancies and some offspring being produced, but generally the litters are a bit smaller there. So we can show that both Rattus and Mastomys are really affected by these. So to summarize, Just to say that there's a number of species now that have been evaluated for EP1. I believe this is the total list of animals that have been evaluated both by Chinese and other Asian collaborators and ourselves. There is this important issue that different species respond slightly differently, so we can't always assume it is going to work in the same way for each different rodent species. Palatability is an issue, but we think it can be overcome usually just by formulating the bait correctly. What is really important is that these fertility control baits are probably commercially viable in the same way that a rodenticide are. These hormones are mass produced, so they're not an expense to make a rodenticide or fertility control product in the same way. So it's really about the components of that bait. One important issue is the trade-off between reversibility. So, animals do eat this bait, and eventually they do recover their fertility. But on the other side of that, of course, that means that anything that was to eat that bait would also recover their fertility. So if this was a non-target animal, it's not a permanent infertility that's being induced by these synthetic hormones. So it is possibly a good thing, possibly a bad thing, depending on your perspective there. So this reversibility does mean that the timing of delivery of the fertility control is quite important. You want to get that at the right time, just before the population would be due to expand, whether that's because of the cropping cycle or the rainfall cycle, so that the rodents are getting that bait just before they would be going into their mating season. So there's a lot more work to be done there. I think there's some quite recent work trying to show that maybe some new innovations with these fertility control baits are required to help manage disease outbreak and disease spillover, particularly when you have ectoparasites on rodents that then go on to attack humans or other animals. So this would be the case of plague, or even diseases such as Lyme disease, where small mammals are involved in ticks that can go on to bite humans. So there are some innovations that could possibly help fertility control work more effectively to prevent disease spillover. So one advantage of working in Tanzania is that it has been quite relatively easy to get it registered there as a commercial product. That's allowing us to expand research and evaluation on it, and hopefully attract some commercial interest and selling it to farmers and other uses there. So with that, I will end. I've used my 30 minutes, and I do want to make sure we have time for questions. So I just want to thank my colleagues. This is Rose Mikundi up here in the top left. He's in charge of much of the research that's been done in Tanzania, and my students along below here, and some of the Asian partners from China and elsewhere that have also been involved in some of the research on these hormones. And so with that, I will thank you, and I hope to have some interesting questions from you all.
Thank you, Steve. This is just amazing work. The scope of it is truly sort of breathtaking, given that a lot of people don't know that there's been a ton of work done in this space for quite a long time, and that it started back in China many years ago, and that people have been collaborating since then to bring it to where it is today. I'm going to start with a couple of questions that I had written down while you were speaking, and then I'll start looking at some of the questions that have been coming in from our participants. So first of all, just about outbreaks generally, is there an increase in frequency and scale of these outbreaks over time? And if so, is there any evidence to suggest that it might be tied to climate change?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So, for example, what's happened in Australia is that for many years they had this prolonged drought. So at the same time, they didn't have any outbreaks of rodents there. And then the rains have come back in recent years, and that means the mouse outbreaks have also come back. Wow. So it is very much, in the Australian context, it is very much related to rainfall. So when you have serious rainfall, particularly prolonged rainfall, then you get these outbreaks. So that's also true in Tanzania and East Africa, where these outbreaks occur. There's areas where they have bimodal rainfall. So you have a short rainy season and then a long rainy season. And sometimes those rainy seasons merge together. So it becomes one very long rodent breeding period, because there's vegetation around. And so the population just grows and grows and grows. So, sorry, there's a lot of other reasons why populations can expand. Some of this is related to bamboo flowering events or tree masting events, which are often somewhat related to climate change. So, these masting events that happen in beech trees, beech forests, sometimes that's because you've had periods of drought followed by rain as well, but it becomes a bit more murky with some of these things, what's driving it. With bamboo, it seems to be a genetic clock. So certain bamboo species flower every 50 years or every 100 years, and that's what drives it there. But we have put together a pretty good book on rodent outbreaks, which if you go online, and there's a free book on rodent outbreaks. If you search for that, you should find it. And it goes into all the different reasons why these rodent outbreaks occur and tries to explain it across the globe in that sense. So I can put you in touch with that if you can't find the link.
Fantastic. So you mentioned towards the end of your presentation about secondary, potential secondary effects, but you were mostly referring to non-target animals that may eat the actual bait. But I don't remember that you mentioned any potential impacts on predators that would eat rodents, that any rodent, target or non-target, that has consumed the bait. But then at the end, you said that it was, there's reversibility associated with it, and therefore probably even less impactful to animals that would eat an animal that is ingested.
Again, I think that this also applies to rodenticides. So if a predator comes along and eats an animal that's recently consumed the bait and still in their digestive system and hasn't been fully metabolized yet, then of course the risk is higher. But if it's an animal that, for whatever reason, it's been predated upon later after having consumed the bait, there's probably very minimal risk there of anything, because there's nothing left. It's either been metabolized or excreted in that sense. So there is that bit of context there, but we do need to do those studies, I think, to really understand what are the non-target impacts there. My more of I think of a concern is what happens just out in the environment. Obviously, we're not going to spread this fertility control everywhere, but there is a lot of worry about estrogens accumulating in the environment, particularly through the livestock industry. So, pig farms, chicken farms, you often get a lot of estrogens in the water supply. We're worried about that, rightly so. But what would happen if we were to commercialize this and people started using these contraceptives for rodent control on a large scale basis? What would that imply in terms of environmental contamination? I do hope that what we know so far about these hormones is that they do break down quite quickly compared to some other synthetic hormones that are out there. So there are synthetic hormones that persist much more, but I think quinastrol and amidagestrol are known, and one of the reasons why they are used is because they do break down quite quickly.
And then when you say quite quickly, can you make that more relevant to the audience? Like, what does that mean, quickly?
Okay, again, there's some good publications there, but in most soils within 24 hours.
So really quickly, like we're not talking about weeks and months, we're talking about.
We're talking quite quickly, yes. And that's one of the challenges in bait formulations. So the bait must stay dry when it's being, if you're storing it, because there's a little bit of moisture into these baits, it causes the compounds to break down quite quickly. But that's a commercial issue that can be dealt with. But that's one of the issues when you put it out in the field. If it's wet, it is going to start to break down quite quickly.
Yeah, and then to your point, what we were discussing earlier, if the idea is to get this into animals before an outbreak occurs, and outbreaks are associated with rainfall, that definitely is going to be a logistical challenge. It has to be overcome. That's a challenge. It can be, it can be. Then are there any welfare concerns associated with the edema that you see in the uterus of female rodents that are treated with it?
Well, I think it is part of the natural process. I'm not sure how much more severe the edema is with our induced synthetics would be compared to a natural estrous cycle.
Okay.
So, they go through it anyway. I'm just not sure if it's that much more severe. It's just because it's prolonged. That's where the, it's essentially the eggs aren't able to implant into a uterus when it's in that state. So that's why it's working in females, I think, that way.
Okay. And then how do you determine the acceptable level that you're attempting to achieve? Like those graphs that you were showing us on what happens with a control population just continues to go up, and then what happens with rodenticide and EP1 treated populations where the plateau is sort of comparable. How do you then determine whether that is an acceptable level, given that a lot of the animals that we're talking about that this is being used on are native animals? They're not necessarily non-native animals, but they're native animals that when these outbreaks occur is when the damage to people and crops can occur.
Yeah. I think that's something we often lose oversight of when we do rodent management. And, professionals do this all the time. They go out, they do their rodent management, and then there's no follow-up. There's no monitoring. What is the impact of that? Was it money well spent? Did it actually have an impact at all? And so one of the things that we're always very keen on is what is an acceptable level of damage? A lot of pest management theories about economic injury levels. So, some damage people will tolerate. If they lose a little bit of their maize crop to rodents or insects or whatever it is, it's
a cost of doing business, because these are our native animals, and you're
exactly. So you do need to monitor whatever the impact is, whether it's food loss in post-harvest systems or in the cropping system or in an urban situation. When it comes to disease spillover, what are you trying to achieve with that rodent control? And by delivering it, does it actually result in something that's beneficial?
And then a couple of questions that we had come in. So I think you may have already addressed this, but effects on the food chain proven or tested? Are these some of what you discussed? Is this anecdotal, or have there actually been studies to show what the effect is?
Yeah, so there are some pretty good studies in China where they've looked at non-target impacts in wilderness areas where they've been doing, particularly they have some species which are related to plague outbreaks, the Mongolian gerbil, for example, and they've done large-scale baiting programs. This is sort of an area just west of Beijing. And so these rodent species, they actually cause a lot of dust storms because they burrow a lot. They degrade the habitat, causing massive dust that then goes over Beijing and causes asthma and lots of other problems.
Yeah.
So they've done a lot of non-target assessment in some environments anyway, to show that they can show no impact on sort of wild bird species. And they've looked into the soil, they've looked into some of the insects and other things there. But this is always the issue with these things, that it's an endless list of different habitats and different contexts and things to evaluate there. So I'm not sure we'll ever have the full answer there, but I do think we need to look more into how is this going to work in different contexts, and the safety to the environment is going to be an important part of that regulation.
And then you touched on something else in a question that was submitted, and that's the relative ease. I'm not going to say it was easy, but the relative ease of getting it registered in Tanzania, and then because of that, being able to do these tests to see about the applicability in these really massive, large-scale areas where you're trying to mitigate damage. But can something like this, even though it breaks down quickly, can something like this be used in a place like Europe, where the use of hormones in the environment is just, frowned upon, even though you have data showing that it breaks down quickly?
Yeah, it's a good question, one that I have in my mind all the time with these things, but I think it is about what are the options available. And if they're going to restrict the current options, policymakers are going to have to be more open-minded to some of these alternatives, like the use of synthetic hormones. And yes, there is this worry, but I think, instead of being worried about it, let's provide the evidence to the policy people that this isn't going to be a huge problem compared to what's already going on with estrogen contamination in the environment.
Or what could happen if you don't do anything, right?
Yeah, the safe use of any rodenticide has to be in a bait box in Europe. And so the same situation have to apply to any use of fertility control. So, it's about reducing risk to a point where you would hope, if the things are used properly and not misused, that they wouldn't become a problem in the environment. But that's always a challenge, isn't it? You know, rodenticides have been abused and misused, and that's one of the reasons why we have some of the problems we do. So there's always going to be those issues in the mind. But if they withdraw rodenticides, which I think is quite likely in the next decade or so, we may have no anticoagulant use across Europe. What are we going to do?
Right. Yeah, exactly. And I think it's a discussion that comes up at some of our symposiums and workshops that we where we have people that are very new to this field that say, well, but why would we want to do that? A, B, and C could happen, but they lose sight of the fact that we're already using something right now that is, you know, much worse. And we're doing it now, and yet it's on its way out, and there's not right now in some of these cases something that's going to quickly replace it, and there will be a demand for those things.
Yeah, I think it's similar to what goes on in the antibiotic field. We hear about antibiotic resistance and think, what are we going to do? There's actually quite a lot of products that are on the sort of pharmaceutical shelf waiting, but they don't want to release it until they have to, in a sense, you know, some of these big companies. So, you know, you can get quite cynical about this, but I think, you know, that policy environment could be facilitating the use of fertility control in the future, just because we have to do something.
So this is an interesting question. Person asked, if we focus on only hormones strategy to control rodent populations, would it be possible that if we suddenly had to stop for any reason, lack of funding, support, political, would we suddenly get an uncontrolled increase and outbreak of rodent populations? Like, would the response by the population be so exponential because suddenly they're not being controlled with this?
Yeah, a good question. But remember, the rodent population sort of stabilizes with food availability.
Oh,
so say if you're in a city and there's a lot of garbage around, the number of rodents is going to be related to the, you know, how much food they have access to. So if you use fertility control but do nothing about your garbage problem, of course, as soon as you stop using fertility control, the population is going to recover back to where it was. And I don't think it'll get worse, but it's certainly going to get back to where it was unless you actually improve some of the other drivers of why you have a rodent problem to begin with, which is often, you know, poor sanitation, or, you know, how you control access to food and harborage and water, which are the main things that any animal needs.
Yeah. So the same participant added probably a combined integrated approach is needed, hormones and restricted access to food waste, trainings and focus groups, or people that could be contributing to it. So it goes back to that. Yeah, this could be revolutionary, frankly, but only if combined with integrated approaches, right?
Yeah.
Let's see here. Are there any studies on what impact, if any, these hormones could have or are having on human handlers? I'm assuming that there's probably a protocol that anyone handling this would have to wear gloves, number one, in case there's any chance that these hormones would be transferable through tactile, like, handling of the substance. But what about aerosol or anything like that?
They're not volatile compounds, so it would be very difficult to make them aerosolized. Even if you were to put, I mean, if you put them into an extreme heat environment, they would break down. They wouldn't really just go up into the air. There is, of course, whenever you make a cereal-based bait, there is dust.
Of course.
So that, of course, would have to be part of the menu. I mean, that's one of the things that the Tanzanian team are looking at and associated with the Ministry of Agriculture is the manufacture of this bait. They don't want it to be dusty anyway, but that is an issue, either whether it's a rodenticide or a fertility control, whatever. You want to minimize that sort of human exposure. You know, you always put a colored dye in it. You try to, you know, it's about packaging and information to the public. If people were to handle it, it's sort of, remember, the dosage is quite low here in the bait itself. It's not a highly concentrated compound. So getting it on your hands and being anything that might be absorbed through your skin is going to be very, very, very tiny. I can't imagine it would have much impact unless you were actually to ingest it. You know, if you got it on a lot on your hands and then put your hands in your mouth or something, then, but I don't think we don't really know, in other words,
Right.
what is that impact. It would probably be quite subtle, and you'd have to do quite a lot of research to understand, how much could go through the skin and things like that.
Is there, I think I know the answer to this question, but if you continued to bait only with reducing amounts, could you reach a sustainable reduction? I think the answer is no, because it's reversible. And so
yeah,
reducing,
I think that there are people, what we have been trying in some of our trials is repeat baiting. So that obviously you don't want to have to keep baiting all the time, but and particularly over some long cropping seasons, like you have in some areas where the rice is the main crop, and it's not always grown synchronously. So it's grown in different fields at different times. And so there becomes a need to try to control the population over a very long time. And so you may need to consider baiting every 3 months, every 4 months, or something like that to keep the population at a certain level. People do that with poisons already.
Right.
So it's it's just trying to understand what is the right interval for rebaiting when that's necessary, and that would have to again be linked to what you know about the rodent breeding cycle.
so it's going to change from species and context for obviously.
But it often a lot of that is known in the cropping system. It's so
Right.
there are ways of understanding what is the appropriate time to bait, and we are reassured that at least when you do bait a single baiting, it does have an impact at least over 2 to 3 months.
Right.
So it's not 100%, but it does mean that you have reduced the fertility of that population, and the population won't be able to respond to the increasing food supply that's going on as the crop grows. There's more and more food in the field, but they're not able to breed in response to that abundant food there. So at least for those key months where the crop is getting ready to be harvested, the population can't expand.
Right. And then is there a way to be feeding them something that isn't treated in between times that you are treating them, to keep them, keep their behavior focused on the bait as opposed to the crop? But
Yeah.
without the added expense of using treated bait when you know that they're not breeding. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, I get what you
Create
mean.
this allegiance to the
A lot of these situations, at least say in Africa and Asia, most rodent populations are boom and bust, and you have a very long dry season. So after the harvest, you get rodents moving into people's houses, following the food as it's stored in the houses. And then it's just so dry outside, there's nothing else to eat anyway. And so the populations collapse. And so you still have a few rodents around, but it would not be economic to try to, it's often very difficult to target those rodents at that time of year anyway.
Interesting.
Mm.
Do we know what reproductive behavior of pups that come from a post-exposed rodent? We know that pregnancy rates drop if they're not zero, but for those pups that are born to animals that have been treated, do we know anything about their reproductive behavior? I'm assuming it does not pass along. I mean,
it's a really good question, and I don't know the answer, unfortunately, but I think there has been some studies with some other mechanisms for fertility control that could have some impact. I think on sex ratio, for example, it might have some impact, but I'm not an expert on that, so I don't know. And I think you just need to do a Google Scholar search to see if there is anything known about that, the impact of fertility control on the offspring in that sense.
Is the drug addiction effect studied? I am not sure about this question.
Well, we must remember that these are compounds that have been fed to humans for generations now. These are part of birth control and hormone replacement therapies, and also the sort of implants and things that are given to people. So I don't think they're addictive. Otherwise, that would have been flagged a long time ago in human trials when we were evaluating these as a birth control for humans.
Could farmers make their own pellets with the active ingredients provided separately using like a local pellet matrix for palatability, or no?
They in theory they could, but that would be quite dangerous because I can buy the pure compounds, and a business can, but that is very dangerous stuff, you know, when it's pure 100% levonorgestrel or quinastrol, it's toxic in a sense.
Right.
So you'd have to be very, very careful, very well trained to be able to do that. So we do make our own bait, and we do it under very careful, you know, considerations. Everyone's wearing masks and gloves. Trying to get farmers to do that, I think, would be quite dangerous, and I wouldn't say it's ethical, probably, to get smallholders doing it. I mean, even just to get the pure compound in, and so it's a bit like trying to, you know, give them pure rodenticide compounds before. That would just be very, very dangerous, I think.
I think you may have already touched on this, the answer to this question, but massing events, as you discussed, and consequent rodent outbreaks are often predictable. And the questionnaire is using the example of beech forests in New Zealand. Said, have you considered targeting fertility control specifically to a mass year to mitigate the consequences? And I think that you said yes.
Yeah, I mean, in Tanzania, there's a pretty good predictive information now based on the rainfall. So they have rainfall models that show what years are probably going to be bad for rodents and may have outbreaks. So the Ministry of Agriculture has a system of alerting different parts of the country, for example, where they can say, we're going to have, this is a bad year for rodent outbreaks. Australia has a very similar system because, again, it's very clearly related to rainfall there, where they know some years could be much worse than others. So again, it will be by context, but where rainfall is the driver of outbreaks, there are some good evidence and good models to make people aware of the problem before it happens.
Very cool. Is there any possibility that rodents treated with this could evolve some sort of resistance to the use of hormones to try and?
Yeah, good question. I mean, we are, again, I would have to refer back to the fact that we've been using these for decades in humans. And I think the physiology is quite well understood, the way these compounds work. So I think it would be quite difficult to overcome, but never say never in the world of nature and science, you know. That I think they'd have to be quite chronically exposed for a long period of time, just like anything to drive that evolution. It would be quite intensive use, I think, to make that a possibility.
This is an interesting question, and I was thinking it too. And this may be a kind of a personal to you, and not necessarily to all of the teams that you've worked with. In your research journey, has animal ethics ever been a driving force behind your work and motivating what you do? And they say by that, I mean, has compassion for rodents ever been a consideration in your work? Fertility control is arguably more compassionate than poisons.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's one of the reasons why, I mean, the whole focus of my career has been trying not to use poisons. I mean, they're not sustainable for the environment. They're expensive for a lot of smallholder farmers, but it's also the ethics of them. You know, we think of anticoagulants, they just sort of die in their sleep, but it is a more painful process than we like to think sometimes. And that's also true of trapping. And, you know, some traps may be quite efficient and kill animals very quickly. Others could mean, you know, they're stuck and, you know, suffering for days or whatever before they die. So, I mean, fertility control is certainly more humane in that sense. And I think that's one of the attractions that we as, you know, as a human race trying to think about the, you know, other animals, that it's important to consider those things. It's not, unfortunately, part of the regulations in any country that I'm aware of. You know, here in the UK and a few places, they've banned the use of glue traps. But, you know, poisons and other things are often very widely used. And again, it's because what are the alternatives? I think, you know, if we had a real fertility control alternative, that might drive a lot of public support for their use. And just because it is, you know, it's just a nicer way to do it. Right.
Right. And then I think this may be our last question. So scale effects, if you treat 1 hectare in a field of crops of like 100 hectares, intensity of baiting in large scale systems, you know, how do you account for things like emigration in and out of
it is an issue, and that's one of the reasons why, you know, when we're doing our sort of capture mark recapture studies, we do bait on a much larger scale than when we're trying to, because there is, of course, immigration occurring, and that's whenever you, particularly if you were to kill animals with poison, you create a vacuum in a sense.
Right.
One of the advantages of fertility control is you don't create that vacuum. So a lot of the dominant rodents are still there, keeping control of their territory and fighting off the immigrants in a sense. So I think there is some evidence it happens, but I think it's much less than what would happen if you were using rodenticide, because you're not affecting the existing social structure that's already there.
That's really interesting, because that is something that we I think anecdotally, but some people are starting to produce some data to suggest in even larger mammals where fertility control is used, that is one of the advantages, is that those animals serve as placeholders, and that because of that, they can stem a bit of the very quick immigration that can occur when you do a very swift cull in a population where that is not built out, and that there is you're not creating this sink what do you call it, a sink source dynamic there. Okay, I think that was the last question we have. So we actually did get through all of the questions that we had submitted. Thank you so much, Steve. This has been just tremendous.
No, thanks. It's been a great pleasure to do this, and I hope it will lead to some more collaboration.
Thank you, Steve. And yeah, I enjoyed your presentation at our conference, and I enjoyed this one just as much. Thank you so much. And as I said, if anyone has further questions that they just didn't think of or get to, please feel free to email the Botstiber Institute. Giovanna, would you like to say anything before we go?
Just say thank you, Steve. Brilliant as always. And to everybody who's still listening, the book is called Rodent Outbreaks. And I would really encourage everyone to download it and to read it, because it's quite interesting and also entertaining.
All right. Thank you very much. And thanks everyone for attending.